Hey, welcome to today's episode. I'm so excited to talk to you today. My name is Precious, and we will be speaking about DEI in open source. So, I recently got on a podcast for the Mechanical Inc. with Scott Nicklin, and basically, we spoke about my journey in open source and DEI, technical writing, chaos. Chaos is the community that I contribute to. And I just really got interested in DEI, particularly in open source and how that works. Right. So we're gonna do like an intro. I feel like we're going to like break this down in another episode, but I just kind of like want to like bring in do like a little intro and just talk about it generally, and then maybe in further episodes we can break it down. Right. So we will explain what DEI is, kind of do a refresher on what open source is, then be specific about DEI and open source and what that means and how we can come into it and participate. Right. So let's get to it. So DEI and open source. First of all, what is DEI? Right. Wikipedia defines DEI as diversity, equity, and inclusion. It refers to organizational frameworks which seek to promote the fair treatment and full participation of all people, particularly groups who have historically been underrepresented or subject to discrimination based on identity or disability, right? My definition is meeting people where they are, right? Because in order to promote fair treatment and full participation of people, um, who have mostly people who have probably been underrepresented, under-resourced, or subject to discrimination, you kind of need to understand their realities for you to be able to bring out policies or create values that respect them and know how to incorporate them in your various organizations, right? So what is open source? We already have an episode on this. It's the first episode, but I'll just do a recap and say like it's publicly available source code. Source code that is made freely available for possible modification and distribution. That's a Wikipedia definition. And as usual, my definition is software or products by the people for the people. And then speaking of how DEI, with respect to open source in particular, one of my favorite things about open source is how much it depends on community, right? So you build a product or you build a very cool product and then you bring it out to the public and you say, oh, this is very open to corrections, or you can fix it on your own, or hi, I just built this really cool thing and I want to know how other people would use it and what kind of modifications they can give to my product, right? I think that's really cool. And so because it's built on collaboration, communities are very, very essential. And in order for communities to be able to properly exist in a way that is sustainable and create a sense of belonging and inclusion for the people who come into these communities to collaborate, especially maybe during your first time, or create enabling communities for them to continually contribute. It's important that we factor in their different realities and how we can make them comfortable enough to want to bring in their various skill sets and their experience levels to make the project or the product or the community in general better, right? So this kind of portrays on why DEI is very important in open source, and it's also part of the reasons why communities like Chaos, which stands for Community Health Analytics in Open Source Software, exist because they work on bringing out metrics or and measures to properly gauge and say, okay, this community is healthy enough, or begin it's healthy enough, both for contributors, for the board members, what is growth like, that sort of thing. So because a huge part of DI involves measuring how healthy a community is, it's really important the kind of work that Chaos does, because then you can be able to properly measure and check if your community is doing what they should. And then so part of some of the importance of DEI is access. Obviously, if you are in open source, you kind of already know one of the key things is how much open source gives you access to communities, to contributors, and to very interesting projects that you may not necessarily have had experience working with if we still went with the closed source software path. So I feel like open source on its own is a huge example of DEI because of how much access it gives to people to personally affect the tools and software that they use, right? And then another importance of DEI generally is exposure to different ideology. When we decide, oh, I want to know what it's like for other cultures and other realities and how much I can respect them or think about these different demographics, these different cultures, these different realities when I am building projects or doing something personal, then or for the general public, then it teaches you how to, like, it teaches you about them, you learn and you incorporate them, right? It also mitigates exclusion because it's very obvious to know communities that factor in DEI. One of the very obvious things is how inclusive it feels. And so when you're not being deliberately inclusive, yeah, unfortunately being exclusive. And so factoring in DEI in our various projects and communities helps us to instinctively mitigate exclusion by default. So it creates inclusive and welcoming spaces because, like, when you've already mitigated exclusion and you're very deliberate about how inclusive your community is, it kind of makes people feel welcome when they join. And then also encourages collaboration because obviously when I feel valued and welcome, I want to put in my resources, my time into trying to make this project and this community better, right? And it also encourages trust because you can trust in the system or the board members or other community members that are responsible for how inclusive and how welcome the space is. And so, like, happy collaborators, happy communities. Right. So, what some of the benefits when you have created these inclusive spaces is how, like, it builds more inclusive and sustainable communities, helps you understand various demographics, helps you create communities where people belong, creates trust, and helps avoid cases of implicit or unconscious bias. And then it generally improves a project's image when people know that for this community you feel included, they factor in a lot of demographics, a lot of realities, and try to make sure that people feel welcome when they join them, right? So that's such an important metric to use to define these. And I want to highlight some. I'm pretty sure at this moment you're like, okay, fine. How do I tell when, or what are some examples of projects that factor in DEI and I can look at and be sure that I'm probably doing the right thing. So I'm gonna give my example specifically to open source. So far, I like these two projects. There is the All in Africa project by GitHub. And okay, so there's the All in for Students project by GitHub, which focuses on underrepresented or students that are subject to discrimination in the US. And then there is the All in Africa program. This was created sometime last year by the GitHub team and Ruth Ikega on spreading open source education to underrepresented or under-resourced people in Africa that are interested in open source from the 5 different regions. So it's span across the whole continent. And that's like a huge part of DEI, spreading education about open source, bringing people into open source and letting them know how they can make contributions and participate on a global level. So yeah, we had like a very interesting number of our first cohort, and it was such an amazing experience. And so we also have the chaos community. Chaos create and review metrics for other open source communities to follow. And it's just really cool because then there's like also the DEI badging where open source communities come like or get a badge if you meet a certain criteria, which is really cool because you can be able to measure with data and like in real time what it is that if some of your measures or if some of your decisions are DI specific and how this affects your own communities, right? It's really cool that they are focused on building inclusive communities. And then there is the inclusive naming community. They have a list of words that you can use to check, oh, am I inclusive? Why don't I use this word? That sort of thing. So I think these three they kind of like represent a large number of other projects that exist and that are used to factor in DEI. I think another really cool part of DEI in open source is projects that work on mechanical keyboards and also keyboards for people with disabilities because it's created in a specific way for them to be able to use, and that's so cool. Uh, Factoring in usability and accessibility, right? So this is obviously going to be part one of this episode speaking about DEI and open source, but really like want to create like more in-depth episodes as we go ahead. But thank you so much for being a part of today, and I hope you learned a little bit about DEI and how DEI affects the open source world. See you next time.